Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Coggin with the North Carolina Rural Center. We're going to give just a couple of minutes to let people sign on, and we will get started shortly. Hello, everyone. This is John Coggin with the North Carolina Rural Center. I'd like to welcome everyone to our spring webinar. We're here with some excellent staff at the Division of Environmental Quality, the Water Infrastructure Division, to talk about the Master Plan for Water and Wastewater Infrastructure in North Carolina. So before we get started, I just want to talk through a couple of technical odds and ends. If you are having any technical questions with getting the webinar to work properly, sound, anything like that, please feel free to give our main line a call. That's 919-250-4314, and our staff will be able to help you with that. Everyone is already automatically on mute, but if you would go ahead and mute your line, that would be wonderful. If you have content questions at any time during this webinar, you can use the questions feature. We will have a Q&A section at the end, so we will be populating your questions throughout to be able to ask our panelists at the end of the time. So in order for that to be robust, we'd encourage you to ask questions at any time that you have them, and we'll be fielding those throughout the call. Finally, in the handouts section of the webinar navigation bar, you'll find three different handouts that we have. Our PowerPoint presentation for the day, our rural counts strategies overview that I'm going to get to in a second, and then finally, we have a one-pager explaining the master plan. So with that, we will get started. All right, we just started recording. So welcome to the Spring Rural Counts webinar. My name is John Coggin. I'm the Director of Advocacy. In our time together today, we're going to give a quick brief overview of some Rural Counts updates from the Rural Center. And then the most of our time we're going to be spending with members of the Department of Environmental Quality, going over the Master Plan for Water and Wastewater Infrastructure. One of the key infrastructure and economic development challenges that our rural communities face is making sure that we have a modernized water and wastewater infrastructure. And last year, the Division of Water Infrastructure put out a master plan. It's a really excellent document outlining different ways of addressing some of the challenges, funding opportunities, et cetera. And Francine, Durso, and Jennifer Haynie, who helped put that plan together, are here with us to get down into the details. So we look forward to talking with them. At the end, we will have a Q&A. So we look forward to having an interactive time with them at the end. So to give you a brief overview, the Rural Center, we've been around for 30 years, just celebrated our 30th anniversary last year, and our mission is to develop, promote, and implement sound economic development strategies to improve life for our rural citizens. The way we define rural is based on population density at a county level. So if you look at this map, we have 80 of our 100 counties have fewer than 250 people per square mile. There's another 6 that we consider urban, that have well over 750 people per square mile. The remaining 14 counties are what we call regional city and suburban counties. And these are counties like Cumberland, Buncombe, Pitt County, and a lot of our suburban counties that are, due to demographic changes in North Carolina, are seeing some really robust changes. But 80 of the 100 counties in North Carolina are still considered rural by our definition. The Rural Counts program, which was launched about a year ago, is focused on several points. First, we're trying to reclaim the rural narrative. I'm sure that everyone on the call today has seen some newspaper report in the not too distant past where they outline how rural places are declining and challenged and disappearing off the face of the earth, and urban areas are shiny, glitzy, progressive, wonderful places to live. And there is what they call an urban-rural divide that is tearing our state apart. That's not the way we see it at the Rural Center. We see our rural counties in all 80 counties in all areas of the state as resilient places full of hope for the future, full of committed people who love living in their communities and want to make them even better. We want to lift up the stories of success, the stories of innovation that are happening across the state in order to inspire other communities that are looking for new innovations, as well as to help bridge that idea of a rural-urban divide and recognize that we only move forward as a state together. In order to do that, we're trying to reunite rural voices from across the state. We're trying to work together with rural advocates across the state on developing policies that address some of the challenges that our rural communities do face. And then we're trying to provide better on-ramps to advocacy across the state so that people who are interested in helping their communities are armed with data, research, good ideas for solutions, and the ways in which to go and engage with leaders to make good things happen. We are also committed to making sure that those relationships with leaders are collaborative and productive exchanges that are helpful for leaders having to make decisions that affect us all, and that are also positive and encouraging experiences for the advocates who might be doing their first try at advocacy. So what are we working on? There are 10 rural counts strategies that we have articulated as being top of mind for rural citizens in every corner of the state of North Carolina. We start with the foundations. We are an economic development group here at the Rural Center, so we want to have high-quality jobs at the end of the day, but that does not happen in a vacuum. We've got to make sure that our people have access to quality education. We've got to develop tomorrow's workforce. We've got to make sure our people have access to quality health care and modernized infrastructure across the board. So that's physical infrastructure, water, sewer, transportation, natural gas, and it's also the digital infrastructure, our broadband services, and connecting to the internet as the next phase in rural economic development. Then we've got to make sure that we're seizing upon the right opportunities for our communities. That's making sure that we have a strong focus on entrepreneurship and small business development, thinking about what types of manufacturing are going to move our rural communities forward and how they're going to look different than they did 20 or 30 years ago. Also, how are we going to think innovatively on the agriculture and natural resources industries that have sustained rural North Carolina for centuries, and how can we move that into tomorrow? Finally, we need to make sure that we are working on all of this collaboratively in regions and across the state, and then that we're targeting technical assistance and capacity building to those areas that need it the most. As you can tell, that's a lot of work to do. So we are trying to work with our communities across the state on figuring out, first, which of those are the top of mind to people around rural North Carolina, and what can the Rural Center do within those 10 strategies to really make a difference. So we have embarked, Patrick Woody, the president of the Rural Center, and I have embarked on a rural road trip. We are in the concluding days of that, visiting each of the 80 counties that we serve and hosting community forums with leaders in the community to hear what's going well as part of reclaiming that rural narrative, and also what people are struggling with locally that they can't solve by themselves. We've done, as of yesterday, 66 counties, and by mid-April, we expect to have the last 14 complete. At the end of that, we will be putting out some more specific information about the ways that we think that we can develop policies around specific areas to enhance the quality of life for rural North Carolina. If you're interested in participating in one of these orange or white counties that we are still working on, you can follow the link on this website. Capitalization matters in this, bit.ly/rural road trip, and find out more information about where our next stops are. We would love to have you. We are hearing some of the same things. One of the reasons that we wanted to go on this rural road trip was to hear those local nuances, because we can talk about these big, broad issues, but things look very different according to where you're coming from geographically in the state. So we wanted to make sure that we had a really strong sense of the nuances across the 80 counties. We're not done yet, but we are hearing some themes emerging. Broadband is rising to the top in many communities as the rural economic development issue of our time. It touches so many different issues, from education to health to public safety to business development, and we've got to make sure that all of our people have access to affordable internet and that they recognize the value of that and actually adopt the technology that's available to them. We also need to make sure that we're addressing our rural health systems, recognizing the economic development opportunities inherent in the strong health system, and then making sure that our access to care is strong. We also are hearing a lot of vocal support for small businesses in our rural areas. 85% of the jobs created in our rural areas are going to come from small businesses, and we need to do a better job as a state of making sure that we're creating an environment for entrepreneurs and our existing businesses to thrive. One thing that's not on our rural counts strategies that we're hearing a lot, just for your information, is workforce housing. In many of our areas, housing is a big issue that we didn't put in our first iteration of our strategies, but in our conversations we're hearing is a big issue. Also, a perennial issue in North Carolina is what to do with our tier system. So we're going to be delving into that more deeply in the future. And last but not least, in fact, first in today's attention is water and sewer infrastructure. We are hearing in so many different counties that aging water infrastructure, the costs of developing further water and sewer systems is a huge pressure point for our communities, one that often doesn't get as much attention as it really needs. And so the people who are living with it on a day-to-day basis, they know what they're dealing with. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. Before we turn things over to the core content of our webinar, I do want to give you a couple of opportunities to get engaged. If you are not yet receiving information about our Rural Counts program, sign up to be an advocate. That basically signs you up to get our Rural Counts newsletter, which is sent out every month, that gives you information on policy, events like this, these webinars, in-person events, and more events. So again, that's bit.ly/Rural Counts Advocate. And then finally, I'd like to encourage everyone on the call today to save the date for our second annual Rural Day. This is the one Advocacy Day in Raleigh that focuses exclusively on rural economic development. That's going to happen on Tuesday, May 29th this year. It's our second annual day. Last year, we brought over 300 people from 70 counties in the state to our first Rural Day. This year, we're expecting it to be even more fun. So we've already confirmed the governor and lieutenant governor, more speakers coming soon, and registration will open at the 1st of next month. But go ahead and mark your date of May 29th, and we hope to see you in Raleigh there. So if you have any questions for me personally, feel free to give me a call at 919-250-4314. Shoot me an email at the address on your screen, or you can interact with me on Twitter at @JohnCoggin. That is all I have for the Rural Counts updates. So now we're going to turn to what you all came for, the master plan for water and wastewater infrastructure. Francine and Jennifer are coming to us from the Division of Water Infrastructure and the Water Infrastructure Authority. Together, they have over 40 years of experience in this field, and it has shown clearly in the excellent report that they put out last year. We read it here at the Rural Center and have been wanting to share it with everyone. So we've been working for some time to bring them here, and we're glad to have both of them here to start out our conversation. Again, I'll do one more request for questions. If you have any questions during the time, I'll be fielding those, and then we'll have a conversation with Francine and Jennifer after they conclude. So with that, I'll turn it over to y'all.
John, thank you very much. This is Francine Durso. We really want to extend our thanks to the Rural Center also for asking us to participate today. And I will say that the Rural Center is a great partner with the division and with the department on many of the crucial issues surrounding water and wastewater, and especially in rural parts of the state. And all the exciting things that John just mentioned, there are a lot of wonderful things that the Rural Center is doing, and we are really honored to be a partner with you in some of these events. So thank you very much for inviting us to participate. So, I'm going to kick off our presentation today, and here you can see the topics that we're going to be covering in about the next hour or so. And we are going to start off talking about the State Water Infrastructure Authority. So in 2013, the North Carolina General Assembly created two new entities. One is the Division of Water Infrastructure, and this division was created to really consolidate the water and wastewater infrastructure funding programs in the state, which had formerly been in different divisions and even different departments. And so the box here on the side shows all of the funding programs that the Division of Water Infrastructure now administers, and for which the 9-member State Water Infrastructure Authority have oversight. The authority, as you can see, we have a pretty diverse makeup of the authority. We have rural county commissioners and mayors. We have rural and urban water utility managers, professional engineer. The director of our Division of Water Infrastructure, Kim Colson, also serves as chair of the authority. And we also have members on the authority from the Department of Commerce and from the Treasurer's Office in the Local Government Commission. So you can see we have a pretty diverse group. And I do want to point out that the authority is the one who makes all the final funding decisions on these programs that are administered by the division. So I wanted to touch for a minute just on some of the tasks that were assigned to the Water Infrastructure Authority when they were created. And these were assigned to them by the General Assembly. So you can see a number of them here. But what I really want to do is talk about 3 in particular on this webinar today. And as we go through this, you may recognize that these, 4 I've highlighted, really mesh very well with all the things that John was just talking about on the Rural Center's 10 strategies for rural North Carolina. So in fact, I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of going through and showing y'all how they mesh up together. And it really is a terrific, I think, body of work together between the Rural Center's strategies and the authority's master plan of how we're going to really start dealing with some of these issues throughout the state. So these are all 10 of the strategies that are part of the Rural Counts document that John was just talking about. And 3 of the 10 in particular are really linked with the work of the authority. So we're going to talk over those. So the 3 that are most closely linked are modernization of rural water and wastewater infrastructure, regional collaboration and partnerships, and stabilizing and leveraging rural development funding, capacity building, and technical assistance. So I'm kind of going to step through these now and show you how they match up. So this is the Rural Center's item number 4, accelerating the modernization of essential rural water and wastewater infrastructure. And what I did was make a table here, and on the left side of the table, Within each of the Rural Center's 10 strategies, they have a number of specific activities defined. So these items that you see here are the Rural Center's specific activities under this strategy. And then what I've put alongside that is things that the State Water Infrastructure Authority is doing or has done or will be doing. So the first one, of course, on the Rural Center side, clearly define the state's role in funding rural water infrastructure. And the authority spent quite a bit of time determining what its role should be related to funding across the state. And the statement here is one that was developed by the authority, but as you can see, the state's role is to really foster long-term viability. And this deals not only with providing capital funds, but also providing resources to help utilities address organizational and financial management challenges, because these organizational and financial management challenges may be contributing to the fact of limitations with the physical infrastructure. So the authority clearly sees its role in participating in these issues. Second, to make the infrastructure allocation from the Connect NC bond count, which I assume means, go to work and be spent wisely. So let me talk for a minute about that. The Connect NC bond provided $100 million in grants and $209.5 million in loans. And these were distributed over 3 funding rounds, and the amounts were capped at $3 million. So I want to comment that one of the reasons it was distributed over 3 funding rounds was to make sure that the most appropriate projects and those for the most needy communities were funded in both drinking water and wastewater. And the authority discussed and determined that if they had awarded all the money in one round, that they may have ended up funding projects that didn't really address long-term solutions, or that could have gone for water and wastewater infrastructure expansion projects instead of repairing existing infrastructure. So you can see in the table, what I've also listed is that the criteria that the authority was using for the bond money, in which they did prioritize fixing existing infrastructure first. They wanted to make sure that they were funding long-term solutions, not just band-aids to problems. And finally, they decided that the best way to stretch this bond money was to combine loans and grants based on affordability criteria. And we'll be talking about the affordability criteria later on today. But these are the things that the authority did to make sure that the money was really well spent, well distributed. And so at least 100 projects were funded under the Connect NC bond money. And so it was not a whole lot of money given out to only a few projects, because the cap was at $3 million. Okay, so continuing on with some more points about strategy number 4. Again, the rural strategies include create regional economies of scale, benefiting everyone. You can see, and we'll talk more in detail about our merger regionalization feasibility grants. But these grants are all about studying regional economies of scale and how to create those regional economies. So that is directly in line with the Rural Center strategy. As far as planning for the future and promoting and expanding best practices, this is actually what the majority of the master plan deals with. And we'll be talking more about this in detail coming up. And finally, the Rural Center strategy to leverage funding resources to create greater impacts. And one of the things that the authority has been charged to do is really figure out how to coordinate and maximize the use of all funding resources, federal, state, and local, and again, stretching those funds by combining loans and grants, not just large amounts of grant, but a combination of loan and grant. So that's pretty much how the authority's work is tying directly in with number 4. Number 10 is the other one I wanted to mention, and this is about stabilizing and leveraging rural development funding, capacity building, and technical assistance. And while this doesn't specifically speak to water and wastewater infrastructure, two of the strategies actually correspond really well to the work of the authority. So the first is targeting solutions for the most economically distressed regions. And what I have here is a quote from the local government commission in the treasurer's office. And this is something that they've seen for a number of years. They really realize that a lot of times a community's water and sewer system can get into financial trouble, and that can really affect, in fact, the whole financial picture for that entity, not only the water and sewer side, but the whole financials of the town. And so we work closely actually with the local government commission. And one of the things that the authority and the commission really agreed on was that long-term sustainable solutions are needed that will enable water and wastewater utility systems to support future economic viability. So this ties in well with fostering economic development by taking care of your water and sewer infrastructure. The last item here is increased region-based technical assistance to build capacity. And I also want to mention that the division and the authority are working very closely with the 16 councils of governments around the state, and we are directly working with them on region-based utility partnerships that could include sharing management, sharing staff, sharing equipment, even purchasing agreements and things like that. So again, the work of the authority is supporting also strategy number 10 on the rural center side in these ways. So let me move on now and talk about the actual infrastructure master plan, which is called the Road to Viability. And I first want to point out, though, that looking again at the authority's assigned tasks, one of them was specifically about developing a master plan to meet the state's water infrastructure needs. And I want to say that when the General Assembly gave this task to the authority, they didn't give them any guidance. They didn't say, we want you to look at A, B, and C. They just said, y'all figure out what should be talked about in an infrastructure master plan and what needs to be addressed. And so actually, as the division, we spent a good deal of time talking with the authority about, well, what are those key issues that they really wanted to address? And so I'm going to talk over some of those now, but one of the first things that the authority did was put together a vision statement for the master plan. And as you can see, the vision statement is that the state will best be able to meet its water infrastructure needs by ensuring that individual utilities are or on a path to be viable systems. And then the authority went on to define, well, what is a viable system? So it certainly is one that operates as a long-term, self-sufficient business enterprise, establishes organizational excellence, which means integration of the importance of water and wastewater infrastructure from the elected officials through all of the staff in the local government, and also providing the appropriate levels, which means funding, of infrastructure for maintenance, operation, reinvestment to allow the utility to be reliable now and into the future. So as the authority and the staff began working on the master plan, one of the first things that we needed to do was get a handle on current water and wastewater infrastructure needs over the next 20 years. And we worked very closely with the University of North Carolina School of Government Environmental Finance Center to develop a range of infrastructure needs. And these cover more than just the needs that are presented in the EPA needs surveys. So these numbers are higher than the EPA needs surveys, if you're familiar with those. The EPA needs surveys numbers can only reflect things that the EPA can fund through the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF programs. But as you can imagine, there are many needs that are outside of that as well. So the one thing we wanted to point out here is that there's really very, very little grant money left. As you can see, we looked at the next 2 years, last year and this year's fiscal years in particular, and broke it down to just look at those 2 years. And in those 2 years, as you can see, there's about 7% of the needs can be funded with grant money on the drinking water side and only about 8% on the wastewater side. But I want to point out that these percentages, the 7 and 8%, these actually include the Connect NC bond money, which has now all been awarded. And it also includes 2 grant programs that the President has talked about eliminating several times. One is the Community Development Block Grant Program, and the other is the USDA Rural Assistance Program, both of which are, I think, remain on the chopping block. So this will give you an idea that there's actually quite a bit less grant money that's going to be available now and probably going forward. And what this really means is that local entities and the users of water and sewer systems are the ones who really are going to need to pay for most of these needs. The other thing we found very interesting was that in 2014, federal grants and loans made up only 4% of water infrastructure spending, and this is across the U.S. And this is compared to nearly 30% that they funded for highway, and another like 25% funded for airports. So the fact that the federal government is spending only about 4% of its infrastructure money on water and sewer infrastructure is really kind of a telling fact. The next thing the authority talked about was, well, what are the characteristics of a viable system? So we got a little more into depth on what it means, and certainly it does mean that all levels of the organization understand that they are responsible for the utility's mission, which is public health, environmental protection, making sure that there's access to clean drinking water and to sanitary sewer systems, and also to comply with a range of regulations. Viable systems also have the ability to access a range of different forms of capital, and that means not simply relying on grant money, of which there is very little, again, to continuously reinvest in the most critical infrastructure components to make sure that you're taking care of the portions of your system that, if they were to fail, could really have the most significant impact on your community. To proactively manage system assets and to really minimize reactive projects. And just a few more characteristics. Again, this idea of functioning as a self-sufficient business enterprise. As I mentioned, that means having the appropriate levels of funding in place without relying on grants for the long term, and also having succession planning in place. We do hear, as we talk with many local governments, that their public utilities directors and some of their most experienced staff are going to be retiring in the next few years, and that there's a whole lot of institutional knowledge that is going to disappear with that. A few other characteristics, of course, transparent decision making, making sure that your customers and stakeholders are engaged and understand the needs that are needed to operate a utility, and then a high degree of partnership with other utilities. And we'll be fleshing some more of these out as we go through this webinar. One of the other things that we address in the master plan is the best practices in utility management, and this actually was a task assigned to the authority as well. And so there are really 3 key areas of best practices. One is infrastructure management, then there's organizational management, and finally financial management. And let me touch on infrastructure management just for a few minutes. There are really important emerging practices that include making decisions based on life cycle costs, and especially on taking risk into consideration. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that it's really important to understand the condition of your system, the condition of the pipes, pumps, tanks, treatment plants, elevated water storage tanks, because the reliability, because the condition of these systems, if they're not reliable, these vital components, then there really is a risk that's being taken on by the community, because if these critical projects continue to be deferred, the risk goes up every year that that they could potentially fail and really affect the whole operations of your water and sewer system, to the point where you may not even have any water to deliver, and you may not be able to process any wastewater. Then, as you can see, organizational management, we've talked about that a little bit already, but especially the understanding by governing boards, and this is usually elected city councils, that it's really important to prioritize those most critical projects so that your whole system does not have to shut down due to some sort of failure. And then financial management, which really is having those sufficient revenues for the future, for renewal, replacement reserves in the future, and ongoing O&M, and helping to establish permanent local funding solutions, again, without reliance on grant funds for the long term. So some of the next questions that the authority addressed were, well, what are the steps to getting started on this? And these really are the three initial steps that can be taken toward achieving the vision of viable utilities. First is resource partnerships, and this is not only between state agencies and key organizations, but this is also partnerships between utility to utility. And we're going to talk more about this coming up as well. And a lot of folks already have really good partnership relationships on the infrastructure side. For example, maybe assisting a neighboring town with equipment needs, or interconnecting with them for water during emergency situations. But we think that there's probably less partnership right now on the organizational and the financial expertise areas. And one of the things the authority wanted to do too was to put together a resource toolbox. And the idea here is that when you go to websites and you start looking for information, y'all know you can spend hours and hours searching for information, and you may or may not get what you want. One of the things the authority wanted to do was to consolidate in the Appendix B of our master plan a whole host of resources that include webinars, videos, publications, agencies and organizations that stand ready to assist you as you work through water and wastewater infrastructure issues. And the other thing that's really important to point out is that many of these are available at no cost. Many of these services are at no cost, and many of the publications and webinars are at no cost either. So it's really an important part of the master plan is our appendix. And finally, as far as prioritized funding, this is what the authority is doing towards making sure that funding is targeted to specific needs that are going to create permanent solutions and not Band-Aid situations, and also to make sure that projects are being funded that are linked to viability. And the authority really takes that seriously when they look at projects for funding. Will this project that's being proposed, is this going to help this entity take a step toward viability? And those are the ones that are prioritized more highly and receive the funding. Just a few other things I wanted to point out, and this is about the number of locally owned water and wastewater utilities across the state. Again, this information was put together by the Environmental Finance Center at UNC, and they've done some very important analyses for us. But as you can see, as of January 2018, there are almost 500 local government-owned water and or wastewater utilities across the state. And nearly 400 of these are owned by local governments. You know, others are county-owned, there's sanitary districts, there are authorities, but as you can see, the vast majority, almost 400 of 500, are owned by local units of government. And the other thing to look at that the EFC did for us as well is they then looked at from survey information that they had from 2016, they looked at 450 of these local government-owned utilities. And the red squares and the pink octagons, well, I don't think it's an octagon, but it's almost an octagon. Together, these are 22% of all these entities, of the local government-owned entities, and that's about 100. So about 100 out of the 450 local government-owned water and sewer utilities, their operating revenue does not cover their O&M expenses, and it doesn't cover their debt service. So as you can see, there's about 100 entities across the state that are local government units that are operating their own water and wastewater utilities that really are not able to keep up with the cost of operating the utility and paying the debt service on loans that they already may have outstanding. And that's a pretty significant number. So what I'm going to do now is turn this over to Jennifer, and she's going to speak more in depth on the key best practices areas. Jennifer?
Sure. Thank you, Francine. So I'm going to cover each of the infrastructure, organizational, and financial practice areas. And one thing I want to start out with is when thinking about rural communities, think about some of the needs in rural communities versus urban areas. Urban areas tend to experience more growth-related problems, and then they also have the economies of scale on their side in terms that they are better able to manage their systems because they have a broader customer base. And rural areas are different in that they have challenges that are unique to that particular landscape. A lot of times what we hear is for infrastructure, it's old at least, right? Something else that we can sometimes have with organizational issues is that there is a lack of adequate workforce both now and also into the future. And then, of course, we hear a lot about the financial challenges that are surrounding rural communities when they lose revenue, not only with the main economic driver leaving town, but also from water loss or I&I, inflow and infiltration. So the first one I want to tackle is infrastructure management. Here are a couple of quotes related to this, and the first one talks mainly about planning for today, is that a lot of systems manage their infrastructure only relating to today's problems. Unfortunately, that gets them into the second quote, which is where because they're so focused on today, they don't focus on tomorrow, and that can sometimes, or a lot of times, lead to trouble. So some of the challenges. There are a lot of challenges related to infrastructure management, and it is important to be able to understand them and see what you're facing. A big one is to understand the consequences should key parts of infrastructure fail. For example, maybe your town has a small hospital attached to it, and of course you have a water main that's serving that hospital. Well, what would happen if that water main failed? Or maybe you have a pump station that's next to a pristine river where there's a lot of fishing, a lot of swimming going on, and what would happen if the pump station failed and the overflow reached the river? So a lot of local government units have infrastructure in such a condition that rather being proactive, they're reacting to various line breaks, and they're running all over town trying to fix these line breaks instead of focusing on the future and planning for repairs. And what happens is that a lot of these local government units tend to flail when it comes to seeking funding. They see a line break and they react to it. And even though the line break may be in a non-critical line, they still try to go after funding rather than focusing on a critical line that might not be too far away, but is weeks away from catastrophic failure. So the importance is to be able to gain a basic understanding of the infrastructure that enables a local government unit to make investments in the right place at the right time so that when they get their funding, they're able to target that funding. So there are a lot of potential solutions related to infrastructure management, and essentially these solutions may enable a local government unit, no matter how small, to move from the reactive mode to the proactive mode and to chart a clear path forward. So as we're getting ready to, as I step into the next two slides or so, think about what challenges your system is facing. So a couple of the potential solutions. You'll hear me talk a lot about asset inventory and assessment grants, so I'll also use the term AIA. Essentially, what this allows a local government to do is to determine what they have both in the ground and above ground, where it's located, and what condition it's in. And what this does is it answers a lot of the challenges that are faced by a lot of small towns in the area, and that is, I don't know where my systems are, my components of my systems are, I don't know the condition, and I don't know what's going on with it. So essentially, this answers a lot of the questions that we have seen in asset inventory and assessment grant applications, in terms that one of the challenges we've heard is it's old, it leaks, it breaks. And so this will, and being able to do an accurate assessment opens the door to a lot of other things. You can actually be able to develop an accurate map from the system, and in turn be able to develop a capital improvement plan. And this enables you, once you have a capital improvement plan, to start shifting from that reactive to the proactive mode, to set rates appropriately. And when I say appropriately, that means meeting your current needs and setting aside future funds for the future. And that also enables the ability to target funding and when to apply for funding, so that the needs that are being met are those that will be replacing the most critical lines on a regular schedule, to avoid having kind of the emergency repair approach that a lot of folks have taken. Another grant that we've started offering in at the same time that we offer the asset inventory and assessment grants, are the merger regionalization feasibility grants. Essentially, these are for systems that are thinking about, well, I'm in the business right now. Do I really need to stay in the business, or are there better options out there? One of the things that we want to point out is, if a system gets this grant, it's completely voluntary as far as implementing the solutions, but it enables them to develop a wide range of solutions through a study. And that can be, maybe you're thinking about physical interconnection, but it does not necessarily include that. It can also be shared management. I think Francine touched on the idea of shared partnerships, where costs are shared as far as maybe personnel or purchasing, etc. And this, what it does, it encourages systems to think more about what would be the true cost of continuing to manage and run your own system, not only just running it, but the cost to operate, maintain, and set aside reserves and run it in a manner that is more like a business. And then that enables the system, if they have this grant, to compare to other potential solutions, such as a management regionalization. So I've talked a lot about infrastructure management best practices, and I want to turn now to organizational management and to talk about that a little bit, because one of the big things is that this captures all levels of a local government unit utility, from governing boards to the utility staff and to those who are actually customers of the utility and stakeholders. And as with infrastructure, there's also a lot of challenges facing a utility in terms of organizational management. I like to joke that this is kind of the wheel of challenges. As you can see to the right, that's actually in the master plan, and you can see where the blue, which is organizational management, does catch up a lot. There are a lot of different challenges facing that. And so one thing to talk about related to governing boards is that they can take many forms. It can be from the elected officials on town councils to your county commissioners who are also elected, to appointed board members if there's a water and sewer authority involved. And these boards play a particular role is in that they hold the purse strings related to an entire local government unit's budget, and any decisions that they make can impact a utility directly. Additionally, for anyone who's been running a utility, and maybe some of you do, this can present challenges because these governing boards can change all the time. Decisions made by one board, may change or may be rescinded if this particular board is not reelected and a new board comes in. So everyone who's been running a water and sewer utility knows that these utilities have both long and short-term needs. And sometimes it's hard to address because water and sewer utilities are generally out of sight, out of mind, and they may get drowned out in terms of what is a short-term need for a sewer utility. So this is something that's critical to think about Because say, for example, you have a town who's run by a town council with one or two industries, and all of a sudden one of the industries leaves town, and this town council is responsible for the budgets for the police, the fire department, and the water and sewer. All of a sudden, revenue is lost, and it gets challenging to address the needs of all of the entities involved within the local government unit. So because a fire department and police department are right there, right in front and center, it's easy to channel funds towards them and forget about the water and the sewer. But that's important to keep in mind. The other thing is, too, to keep in mind that the water and sewer utility staff are critical to managing the systems. And they also can face challenges. And one of the hot topics that we've heard a lot in the AIA applications, and Francine touched on, is that key personnel like maintenance staff and utility directors and operations staff who have more than 30 years of experience are beginning to retire. Maybe there's nothing written down. There's no succession plans in place that allows for an orderly passing down of information. So this is something that really needs to be considered when thinking about organizational challenges. Also, a lot of local government units can struggle financially, and that results in the inability in the present to fully staff a utility to run the system. And so a result is that maybe partially trained staff or even partial staff are left to manage a very complex system. So the other thing is, if you've been in the utility business at all and you're actually maybe a utility director in a similar position, the need to communicate to a wide variety of audiences can be a challenge. And that can be communicating to your governing boards, because that definitely, because since they hold the purse strings, they need a certain form of communication. And then also when you're communicating with stakeholders, that requires a kind of different skill set as far as communication. But they're equally as important, because if rate discussions and rate increases discussions are being brought up, they need to understand the reason for the rate increases as well as the governing boards. But I don't want to leave you with no potential solutions and just a bunch of challenges. So I want to once again go back to the Master Plan Appendix B, which is the resource toolbox, which has a lot of different organizations mentioned. 22 organizations overall. A handful of them are mentioned here that I'll touch on in just a second. 16 good publications and 10 tools and webinars. And as Francine mentioned, all of these are free and can be downloaded today. And the Rural Center, of course, is one of our key partners. They were very key in reviewing the master plan. The NC Rural Water Association has lots of training available and lots of help available to deal with these organizational issues, as does STIRCAP, which is our Southeast Rural Community Assistance Project. And a couple of others are the UNC School of Government is really, really good as far as they are eager to help out and to help systems that are struggling address their organizational needs. So I do encourage you to check those out. I also encourage anyone who is maybe thinking about feeling overwhelmed and about the need to potentially get out of the business to really consider a merger regionalization feasibility grant. Okay, the last best practice area is the financial management side of things. And one of the big things to note here is that it covers what's needed in terms of the money that's needed to run a sewer system in a viable manner. And this involves a lot of planning to make sure that the revenues are generated to construct, operate, maintain, and repair and replace utility infrastructure. And that just doesn't include today's needs, it's also tomorrow's needs as well. And the key is to do it without long-term reliance on grant funds. Of course, there are a lot of challenges related to financial management as well. A lot of rural communities I mentioned earlier had one or two industries, and what these industries would do is they would construct the water and the sewer system, and then they would hand it over to the local government units to run. And also, then some of these industries would start leaving, and that would cause a drop in revenue. A lot of people would start leaving as well to follow the jobs, and that would decrease the customer base, which decreases economies of scale. Yet at the same time, costs are rising, and that creates maybe the unpopular issue of needing to increase rates to meet the needs. And it's also to, as we've mentioned earlier with the management challenges, when it's hard and money is tight, to maintain the adequate staff with the adequate training to make sure that the system is managed well. So when you have rate increases going on with a governing board, when they're faced with that issue, plus they actually have to enforce policies to maintain financial viability, and that can be unpopular as well. So you can see that there's a lot of financial management challenges going on. But that doesn't mean that there aren't solutions. I bring up the merger regionalization feasibility grants again, because what happens is if you have the potential for shared management, staff, purchasing agreements, equipment, etc., that can broaden the economies of scale and get some advantages there. Also, the local government commission is a great resource. They are definitely interested in the financial health of the towns and cities and local government units within North Carolina, and they do have an assistance program in financial administration, and they also offer finance officer training now. And finally, the UNC School of Government and the Environmental Finance Center is very interested in maintaining the long-term financial viability of local government units, especially their utilities. And they do work to build the capacity of local governments for financial and all the three management areas. And also they offer a lot of different courses, webinars, and specialized conferences on financial management of towns. And speaking of finances, one of the things that has been mentioned by Francine, and the authority is, I agree, is very, very interested in this, is that the need to be able to foster viable utilities, and that can get wrapped up into what we call affordability. And affordability, what happens is that they use the affordability criteria to target grant funds for permanent solutions, not just band-aid situations that will return over time. And historically what happened was that they recognized that not everyone needs a grant. Those who can only afford to pay, those who can afford to pay need to do so. And also, the reason why they wanted to do this was to develop a new funding approach to increase access to at-cost and no-cost capital to the most economically distressed utilities. And they're really focusing on those utilities that already have high rates and high debt service per connection. So essentially, they're trying to hit those who cannot really afford to pay back a loan. And so this has led to a lot of discussion about affordability. So what the authority did was they worked to develop an affordability criteria that you can see here as far as 4 elements of the affordability criteria. Because initially, the typical traditional historic affordability measure was rates per median household income, and they just didn't think that there was that was really hitting enough of the issues, and it was actually more complex than that. So what they first did was looked at targeting populations that are less than 50,000 people. In other words, they're really looking at targeting the limited grant funds down to those who are smaller communities. Then they wanted to further target them to communities that were worse off economically than other communities within the state. So they looked at 5 economic indicators and decided that if 3 of the 5 indicators were worse than the state benchmark, then they would move on to the next step. And those indicators are population change, poverty rate, median household income, unemployment, and property valuation per capita. So as you can see, there's a lot more in consideration than just the median household income of a community. And finally, they further revised it or further honed it to make sure that it was available for economically distressed utilities that already have high water and sewer rates. So that was getting at the rate portion that I mentioned earlier. So they looked at existing revenues, annual debt service, and monthly water and sewer bills. And if a person made it to the 4th step, in other words, that bottom triangle, then they would be placed on a matrix that looks like this. And essentially what this matrix says is if your monthly utility bill is greater than $33 per 5,000 gallons, or if your debt service per connection is greater than $210, then you would be eligible for some form of a grant. If systems wound up in that bottom left quadrant, then essentially what the authority was saying was that their rates are low enough and they have enough debt capacity to be able to take on a loan without a grant. So these, as you can see, these grants, depending on how high the utility bill is and or the debt service per connection, that would be where someone would land as far as a potential percent grant. So say if you had a utility bill of $48, then you would be up at the 75% grant range if you were still lower than the median for debt service per connection. The big thing is that if you're considering applying for a potential loan with our state reserve funds, we do have an affordability calculator on our website, and it's a really nifty tool that you can use to quickly determine what percent grant your local government unit might be eligible for. And I do encourage you to check it out as you're considering funding through our programs. Now I'll turn it back over to Francine.
Thank you, Jennifer. The next thing we're going to talk about is a troubled system initiative, and this was another specific task that was assigned to the authority by the General Assembly when they were created. The goal of this initiative is to really look at both water and wastewater infrastructure issues and the associated organizational and financial issues. And this is the thing I was talking about earlier, where the local government commission really looks at the financial situations of local governments. And I certainly want to point out that not all rural systems are troubled, and that not all troubled systems are rural. So this really covers a gamut of systems. But the goal here, again, is to assess really what's going on, infrastructure, organization, and financial areas, and then to come up with permanent alternatives, again, so we're not just band-aiding situations, that address all three of these areas, with the main goal being that adequate and safe water and wastewater services are provided. This is something that we are undertaking right now. We're actually doing a pilot project and looking at several communities together that are considered troubled by the local government commission. And this is just the general scope of what we're doing for them. As you can see, we're going in and looking at the actual physical condition of the infrastructure. We are reviewing everything that's going on with their finances on the utility side, but also their general fund side. We are listening and understanding the perspectives of the local leadership. We understand that there are a lot of issues associated with wanting to own and operate your own water and wastewater infrastructure. And we understand that, but we also want local leadership to just think about options beyond that, and that also ties in with our merger regionalization feasibility grant. We are doing a thorough evaluation to figure out if they can function as a long-term self-sufficient utility for the future. We're looking at the costs, to what it's going to take to upgrade, repair, and replace the infrastructure, much of which has really received very little O&M since it was installed 20 to 30 years ago. And then we're trying to figure out, well, what level of funding is really needed to function as a self-sufficient entity. Going beyond that, we're then looking at potential alternatives of how do you provide water and sewer services as a viable utility, and also looking at what type of agreements might need to be in place to implement a certain alternative. For example, if communities were going to work together, then a legal agreement framework is needed. And finally, just wrap up for a few moments. So here's a couple of the takeaways. These are the things we've been talking about this afternoon. Of course, the vision is for viable utilities across the state, organizational and financial needs that are every bit as critical as the infrastructure and construction needs. The important role of governing boards, because these are the ones who really make the long-term decisions about where the funding is going to go. Is it going to go to water and sewer infrastructure? And it really is about investing in a town's economic future. And the other thing to realize, and it's, can be difficult, but when you're talking about water and wastewater infrastructure, you're talking about equipment and piping that's going to last for 50 years. And it's really hard to make decisions that need to be made for the future when potentially an elected official's term is 2 to 4 years, and that's all they're looking at. So we recognize that is an area of concern as well. Again, in our master plan, and we'll have a link to our master plan here in just a few minutes, but again, there are dozens of organizations that have these ready-to-use tools, many of which are free. And again, the authority's real emphasis on targeting the use of limited grant funds to create permanent solutions and to support those entities that are involved in wanting to move toward proactive system management. As far as the next steps, this is really the bulk of our work for this year coming up. We realized that the 16 regional councils of government across the state are really an important venue to talk with elected officials about the master plan and about these same ideas that we have gone over with y'all today. And we are right now scheduling to go to each of the 16 COGs to one of their regular COG meetings and, do a short presentation on the master plan. And these meetings are attended by local elected officials primarily. And so we really feel like we'll be able to have conversations with the mayors, with council members about what are their concerns about their water and sewer utilities. And again, conveying some of these ideas of the master plan and what the State Infrastructure Authority is looking at as far as the future of funding in North Carolina. The other two things we're really looking at is how well that affordability criteria that Jennifer just went over, how well has that really worked? Have the grants been going to the people that we thought would be targeted when we set out that criteria? And many of our asset inventory and assessment and merger regionalization feasibility grants will be ending this year or next year. And we want to go back and really understand the benefits. What did the folks that got these grants, what did they learn? What did they do? What are the next steps? Did it make a difference in how they're looking at their water and sewer utility? And the authority is very interested in understanding this to know if these grants are producing the kind of benefits expected, and if not, maybe there's some tweaking that needs to be done to those grants. I just mentioned the troubled systems, and we are working on that this year. And the other thing that we're working on with our sister division, which is the Division of Water Resources, also in the Department of Environmental Quality, is kind of the crossover between having adequate infrastructure and adequate water supply. You may, if you have adequate drinking water supply, but your infrastructure is not in good shape, your supply is not really going to be able to get to the users. On the other hand, if you haven't planned for your future water supply, then you've got infrastructure and you're not going to have enough supply to actually meet the demands. So we really see this as kind of a joint discussion, and that all of these issues are the same, though, because they're all around public health, quality of life, economic opportunities, and environmental protection. This is our division website, and also the website for our authority. And John, maybe at some point you could just have a link to all this on y'all's website. And then this is the information, this is the link to the actual master plan itself, which you can download from our website. And this is Jennifer's and my contact information. The other thing is, if you would like hard copies of the master plan mailed to you, we can do that if you send us an email. Any of you that may have specific requests for us to come and speak to your town, to your public utilities director, but really we're more interested in probably speaking to your elected officials, mayors and councils. We would be happy to do that as well. So please contact either Jennifer or I, and this is what we're really spending the bulk of this year doing, much as the rural center is visiting in the 80 counties, you know, we're really working to visit with as many folks as we can this year. And I think that is it. I think we've received a few questions.
Yes, yes. Thank you both, Francine and Jennifer. This has been a wonderful session. And actually, some things have not even just been questions, but have been praising the presentation y'all gave. So thank you for being with us today. It's like I said earlier, everywhere we go in the state, people are struggling with viability of issues, so on one side of the coin or the other. So this has been very well received. So in the time we have left, I do want to get to some questions. And if you have a burning question and haven't typed it out, we do have some more time, so feel free to keep on sending the questions. But I want to kick things off by saying there was a question about how do we enhance public understanding of these issues. Earlier, Jennifer, you said that a lot of times this is out of sight, out of mind. When you're thinking about not just talking to elected officials, but helping understand helping the people who elect them understand these needs and the issues underlying them, do you have any suggestions for being able to do public messaging around these issues?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to comment on again, because we will be meeting with the COGs and the elected officials, and we realize that some of the things that are really needed are our communication tools for information to increase understanding, you know, of citizens in the towns. Right now, the Environmental Finance Center actually does quite extensive training. Most of it is targeted to public officials, but they also have an excellent blog. And to find them, you can just Google like UNC Environmental Finance Center, and their page will come up. So they post blogs that are very short, they're well written, and they actually dive into, in a short amount of time, dive into some real depth on the issues. And I think this would be helpful for anybody to read these and to understand what's going on with infrastructure, financing, and so forth. The other thing is in our resource toolbox, we do have a couple of links to some communication tools that talk about strategies and specific messaging. However, at the authority level, we have also talked about the need to assist with putting more of this type of information together. And so that is probably something we're going to be working on this year as well. Rural Center, I know you guys have a lot of information that's available as well.
Yes, yeah, we do have more, and we're also working on putting more materials together as well. So looks like further opportunities for partnership. Another question has to do with the Troubled Systems program. Someone asks, have the thresholds yet been released for that program? And if not, are there any early indications from the pilot about what those characteristics are and what would help a program understand if they're a good fit for the Troubled Systems?
Okay, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
There aren't really any specific thresholds right at this point. What we've done is work very, very closely with the Local Government Commission on this. And so jointly we are kind of looking at, because they're looking at the financial side, and that's actually where a lot of this starts, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of times a water and sewers utility within a town can create financial problems for the whole entire town. And so the Local Government Commission actually looks at the water and sewer finances, and they look at the general fund finances, which is the whole town as well. And so as we talk with them about what they're seeing on the financial side, then what we do is within the division is talk about, well, what are the issues that we may know that is going on the water or sewer side with these entities? You know, what kind of loans or grants do they potentially have? Are they somebody who actually has not ever come in and talked with us about their ideas for projects that may need to be done? I guess the other thing to point out here is too, our group is really very focused and open to talking with anyone who has any questions. you know, even if you don't know much about our programs, actually that's a perfect reason to come in and talk to us. We're very accessible, I will say that, and we enjoy explaining to people about the programs and helping y'all figure out, well, this might be a good fit for you, this type of grant or project, and what we can fund, you know, and what we can't fund, and we're just very honest about what we can and can't do. So that's kind of a long-winded answer on that.
Okay.
But that's how we're starting to figure out communities that may need some assistance under this program.
Also, for example, I had a community who called me up, and there was some confusion about, I think it's just in general, when someone looks at the whole funding programs, not only us, but other federal agencies that have funding out there, and I helped them to figure out, well, maybe they don't necessarily need a project grant right now, but they need to know what's in their system. And so not only can we help you figure out, well, is this a good application for a good project, but do you really need this at this point, or do you need something else? And so that's one of the services that we can provide.
Thanks. You talked a lot in the presentation about merger and regionalization efforts. And that's something that we hear about a lot. And it's a big struggle. It's a different way of doing business and a big step for a local system. Do you have any examples of successful efforts for merger or regionalization? That could be either in North Carolina or anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, there's a couple of ones that I know about. One of the first ones, and they've been historically have been a frequent customer through our system, is the Yadkin Valley Sewer Authority, and they're up based in, I think it's Jonesville, Elkin, and Rhonda. And I think I'm not clear on exactly the whole history of what drove them to form a water and sewer authority, or a sewer authority, excuse me, but I think a lot of it had to do with the whole issues of viability that they were seeing, and they thought, well, if there's strength in numbers, let's go ahead and form this this authority. And that's exactly what they did. And they've been very successful in pulling their resources together and really making some good strides in the three towns to be able to deal with a lot of the water and sewer, or mainly the sewer issues, of course, instead of water, that are associated with that particular area. Another one that I can think of as far as like a management is the ONWASA, which is the Onslow Water and Sewer Authority, because I believe, from if history is correct on me for this, there were a bunch of small systems in Onslow County that were all separate, and they were having issues as far as being able to maintain their system well and manage it well. So rather than continue to struggle on as small systems, they wound up creating this Onslow Water and Sewer Authority, and that enabled them to pool their management resources together and to be able to manage a lot of different physically separate pieces of infrastructure, but as one unit. So those are the two that I can think of right off the top of my head that have been successful, and where it does go to show that a lot of times there's strength in numbers, you get good economies of scale, and you can take steps to be viable in that particular manner.
Okay, thanks. Another question that came in was around systems with excess capacity. So say a town used to have a large manufacturing plant, no longer has that in town, but still has that viable system. Do you know of any innovative uses for such systems?
Yes, we're actually looking at a situation like that right now. So we've got a handful of small utilities whose it's on the wastewater side, but their wastewater treatment plant is quite old, and it needs so many repairs. And when you look at the cost of it, the question is it worth repairing this treatment plant or looking at another alternative? And in talking with some neighboring other utilities, we and they have found that there is a neighboring utility with quite a bit of wastewater capacity, and it was built for that exact reason. In fact, they built it to accommodate some industry that then never materialized. So they actually have a large sewer outfall that is barely being used, and they have a lot of excess capacity in their treatment plant. So what these groups are, and they're just starting to talk to each other now, but they're realizing the economy of scale and that it would actually help both entities. The one entity would not need to spend the millions that it would take to upgrade their treatment plant, and the other entity has excess capacity and additional flow would actually help them operate their plant better. So we do have at least one of these situations going on right now, and we are hopeful that this would be the kind of thing that through talking about the master plan, that these sorts of conversations between utilities could become more common. And it would work as well on the water treatment plant side, absolutely, just as well on that.
Okay. Thank you. And then I think as our time together comes toward an end, I'll end with one question that sort of starts where we began, talking about the reclaiming of the rural narrative and breaking down the idea of a rural-urban divide. You've mentioned that rural and urban systems face very different challenges in the state. Do you know of ways either happening or that could happen where systems could work better together to balance needs for, say, urban growth and rural viability?
Yes, I can talk about that a little bit. As Jennifer and I have started meeting with several of the Council of Governments in preparation of going to their regular meetings and speaking with them. And a lot of the things that have come up as we talk with the COG executive directors is that within their COG, they have a number of urban entities and they have a lot of rural entities. And the COGs, I will say, are seeing also that they are a bridge to this gap. And I think the more that we talk about that with them as well, I think that kind of communication is maybe where this is best going to start, because as y'all know, the COGs encompass several counties. So you've got counties that have similar issues in similar regions of the state. And we really think that perhaps through the COGs, that would really be a way to start bridging some of this as well.
All right. Well, Francine, Jennifer, thank you so much for your time with us today. I hope everyone that's joined on the webinar found this as useful and as exciting as I did. I want to let everyone know that we did start recording this webinar. I forgot to click the start button at the beginning, but I got to it before we started with the content. So there will be a webinar awkward start on YouTube coming up soon. But please, once that gets posted, we're going to start sharing that around and letting people know that that's available. So if you got a lot of value out of this, please feel free to share that link once it comes out with other people you think would be interested. Please don't hesitate to contact any of us with further questions or ways that we could support you in your efforts. And we just really thank you for your time this afternoon and hope you have a good afternoon.